Hey, welcome to the Eyes on Jesus podcast with Tim and Drew. So thankful to have you here. We have a special episode today we're throwing your way where you're going to get to learn a lot more about me, a lot more about Tim, and hopefully in response, we're going to get to learn a ton about you as well. And I think it's going to be a great challenge for us as listeners. I think it's going to be a great challenge for us as a community, and I'm really looking forward to it. Tim, how are you today, man?
Wait, does this mean I have to be vulnerable? I didn't know this.
Oh
Oh my
no,
goodness, I'm
not
out. No.
vulnerability. Oh, I know, right? Well, so
No.
today you're right. It is about vulnerability. Today we are going to share our testimony, and the goal of this is that you would learn about us, and then at the end we're going to challenge you as well to respond and share yours with us a little bit. But
That's right.
first, let's just start right there. This is such an important thing for us to be able to not only do, but be reminded about, because this is the reminder of when grace came into our life. This is a reminder of when Jesus came into our heart. This is a reminder of why we do what we do, who we are, and who we're supposed to be. And so, Tim, with all that being said, lay it on me, man. Tell me about when you asked Jesus to come into your life and that journey.
So testimony is a tricky thing for me because, I grew up in the church, and so my dad was a pastor. My parents were godly. And so I struggled for many years being able to share my testimony because I didn't have this, what I would think, powerful testimony where, I came off drugs or I came out of, hitting rock bottom. And so I could just share that on
Yeah.
how God healed me. And so there was this kind of stigma that and it wasn't stated, really directly, but if you didn't have this like testimony that is, top 10 of all time, then you can't really share it. And it was really a lie. And I had to really get some wisdom from mentors and be able to know that we all have a testimony, and it doesn't have to look like the other person's to be powerful, because
Right.
the testimony is about God's grace upon your life and his faithfulness, even when you weren't faithful. And it's not just a one-time thing either. It's not just the testimony of like, oh, I accepted Christ at this time. The testimony is God's faithfulness year after year over your
Yeah.
life. And so I part of my testimony, as a general start to this, is God's faithfulness over my life, so that I didn't have to get to that point, so that I
Love
didn't
it.
have to get to rock bottom, because of the foundation that was built upon my life from my parents and godly counsel, to allow me to know that I had that upbringing, so that I could always turn to God, that I knew that I could go back to him even when I struggled, and I did struggle, and I had struggles, and all these things that God did pull me out of, even in the midst of being a good Christian, quote quote. But the start for me was really at a young age. It was young. I accepted Christ when I was 6. Baptized. I remember even getting the baptism of the Holy Spirit when I was young, and that really started me off with a great childhood of probably the height of it being around 13. And I mentioned this on a previous show too, is I would just have devotions every day. I would get in the Word. I would ask my dad
Right.
questions. I would make sure that that time was a part of my day, and it wasn't something I was forced to do. I was encouraged to do it, but I still wanted to do it.
Right.
And I started having faith just for praying over a headache for a friend. Or I remember just being like awed by God and wowed by the fact of, oh, this is real. This is something that my young faith can grasp onto. And I think what happens many times is that we start getting jaded once we start, quote, learning things. Once we become learned humans, we start to question more of
Mm.
the divine, because it's so hard to put God into a human box. And so we start to listen to other voices, and we start to go down a path that maybe is not where we started, or not where God wants to take us. And so for me, that was a big part of my childhood. Another big part of my childhood was what became later as a stumbling block in some ways, was the focus on the end times. And,
Okay.
I can't really talk about my childhood without talking about the constant talk about the rapture, about how at any moment, we're getting out of here, to the point where when I was 13, I knew for a fact I would not be going to high school. Right? I knew that it would be so close that at any moment I would look at my calendar. I remember this in my room. I would look at my calendar and be like, I don't think I'm going to see December,
Wow.
and it became this expectation where, uh, to a point where it became, like I said, a stumbling block where this stuff didn't happen. And now I start to question, my dad. I start questioning God. I start questioning,
I
like,
gotcha.
is
Yeah.
this even because once you start throwing out pieces of what you believe, then you start have to think like, is everything I believe wrong? Right.
Yeah.
And it starts to become like almost a deconstruction type of thing without the word using today, where, okay, what is true? Like what can I actually hold on to if the rapture is
Right.
not happening this year, or maybe even in the next 10 years? What do I actually believe? And so for me, that became something where to this day, I still have to look back and say, okay, that was a learning experience for me. That's
Yep.
understanding that you can't put dates on this whole thing, that understanding that there is work to be done here on earth and not just
Right.
looking for a ticket to get out of here. Like a lot of that maturity had to come through what I would say is a hardship of getting to that point. I don't know, people watching will remember these rapture movies that came out in the 70s that were super cheesy, but man, they were scary because they just brought you into this world of like, oh man, I do not want to be left behind. I don't want to
Right.
deal with whatever, governments coming, that kind of stuff, and oppressiveness. And so there was a fear-based mentality to the end times. And, I remember like even a couple moments where like I couldn't find my parents. It's like, oh, I missed it, right? I missed it. It's this fear based that I'm going to miss the boat. If I sin and I don't
Wow.
repent immediately, then I could be in danger of not making the rapture.
Mm,
And so this fear
mm.
based mentality probably kept a lot of people from doing bad things, but it's not the heart behind what God wants people to understand about the end times. And regardless of what you believe about the end times, I think at this point, I'm more of an agnostic, meaning that I'm open to whatever God wants to do for the end times. I'm open. If it's still the rapture, then great. If we're stuck here in the tribulation, great. If it's something else I don't even understand, either way, God's in control and God's coming back. And
Yep.
I have peace knowing that. Now, at the end of the day, I'll still put my cards in on that there is a pre-tribulational rapture, just because that's what I was
Yep.
raised with. And I think there's a lot of evidence pointing to that. But at the same time, it's a secondary issue. It's not something
Right.
that if you don't believe that, you're not going to heaven, right?
And we've talked about this before. You brought up the fact that most of what Christians argue about between other Christians are such secondary issues to
Yeah,
the gospel and what we're actually trying to achieve together.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that was a lot of my younger teens. And once I, grew up into going to college, I remember another turning point for me was college, and I went to Arizona State. And
Now
the
that school, that's like a super tame, like Arizona State. They're super
yeah, no, it
tame,
it had
right?
a reputation for party school for sure.
Still
But
does.
but the cool part is I was connected with a Christian, organization, Chi Alpha. I was connected with Christians from day one, basically, and I never really got stuck into the party cycle. So that's another part of my testimony, that I could go to issue and be focused enough on my grades to not,
Right.
be drawn away from what was important at the time. But I do remember a Religion 100 class I took, and I remember it being so eye-opening. Now, this was before I'm even thinking now, like in such a secular schools now and what they teach and how people go in and come out,
Mm-hmm.
completely atheist and
Oh
liberal.
yeah.
But even at the time, it was very much a, here's a snapshot of all the religions and what they believe and how Christianity is just one of thousands. And
Right.
I think some of it for me was that I hadn't really been exposed to some of that. Not all of it, because you hear about other denominations, other religions, especially growing up in church, but not studying it out or realizing that some of the similarities that people claim is that, oh, this is just the same story, like the flood repackaged and repurposed. Some of the myths that they say about Genesis, so these can't be substantiated. All these
Right.
things that they try to discredit the Bible for sounds legitimate when it's coming from a professor and from these educated resources and all that kind of stuff, that it does make you wonder, have I been duped? Have
Sure.
I been duped,
Yeah.
And so that put me on a path of not denouncing my faith, but really wondering, do I have answers to all of this stuff?
Mm.
And that put me on a path of understanding apologetics more, understanding why do I believe what I believe, and also realizing that some things that I believed within Christianity was not necessarily what I kept through adulthood, like I talked before
Yeah.
about either the rapture or only, certain denominations or certain beliefs makes you a true Christian, quote, quote. And so I had to really, I think, be flexible in that journey of saying, God, I still believe in you. I just want to make sure that I'm led by truth. And there's no
Sure.
way that all of these religions can be true. That's a given, just understanding all the differences that they believe. And so take me down a path of understanding, why do I believe what I believe? And so that was, I think, out of my college years, the biggest thing of my testimony, to come to a point where my faith became my own at that point, right? So
Yeah.
it's not that I didn't believe in God, but at some point when your parents are with you and pushing you to read the Bible, there's some point where your parents are no longer there constantly telling you stuff, where you have to say, is this truly what I believe? Is this what I'm going to stand for
Yeah.
the next 20 years? And, having kids now, I look and I say, I really want to make sure I equip them for
Right.
questions that come up. I want to make sure that I equip them to ask questions, to say it's okay to ask questions. It's also okay to not know everything, because that's where faith comes
Right.
in. If we knew everything, we wouldn't need faith, right?
Right. Right. Totally.
And
So,
so, yeah.
well, one thing that sticks out to me is you have, even from a young age, you would have like questions, or you would have thoughts on different things, but you were always willing to like dig and try to find out.
Right.
Do you think that that's something you learned from your dad? Do you think that's something you were just like born with, or is that a habit that you kind of had to really hone in on? Because I know for me personally, and probably for a lot of our listeners, that's where a lot of people get hung up.
Mm-hmm.
That's where a lot of people just stop.
Yeah.
They have a question and then they go, and I don't know, no one knows, and they just kind of move on. Where do you feel like you discovered the discipline to really dive into that kind of uh like digging habit?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of that came from my dad, who really
Yeah,
encouraged questions, and it was, at the end of the day, he told me what he believed and why he believed it, but he didn't, you know, shun you for having a question or a doubt. And I think that's
sure.
an important part of the Christian experience. Is a lot of times you're looked upon negatively for having a doubt or having a question. I know you just have to have more faith, brother, right? And
Right.
there is a part of that with faith, but at the same time, it's not blind faith. And so we have to know exactly
Right.
what
Yeah.
we believe and who we believe in. And as humans, we have this, I think, desire to know about our creator. God has
Right.
planted that in us, to have a desire. That's why so many, other civilizations have come up with an explanation for God, because it's something innately in us to want to know more than just what we see,
Sure.
because we know there's a creator by looking at his creation. And
Yep.
so that leads us on a path of then discovering, where is truth. And in a culture today where truth is so relative to what you believe and in your feelings, which we'll do an episode on that, that it's important to be grounded in the word of God. And my dad grew up in a seminary. Well, he went to a seminary, first of all, when he went to seminary, that he had to back out of, because the seminary was very progressive, even in the 60s, which I find
Wow.
fascinating, how far they've even come
Oh
in
yeah.
50, 60 years now. But the seminary, I remember he would tell me stories that it was, the fables of Genesis was one of the classes he had to take. And it was just discrediting the foundational part of the beginning of Genesis, the first 10 chapters. And for him, it's like, no, I stand on the word of God, that it is what it
Mm-hmm.
is. And when you
Mm-hmm.
start picking apart a book of the Bible, let's say, someone said, I've heard it said that, oh, Moses never existed. There's no record that Moses existed. If you start going down that path and you say,
Yep.
okay, I'm going to take out this book, I'm going to take out this story, I'm going to take out, some people want to take out the whole writings of Paul. I just
Sure.
want to follow Jesus. I don't want to deal with Paul. When you start to do any of that, you're dissecting the word of God down to what is appealing to you. And when
Right.
you do that, it becomes no longer the word of God. It becomes your words packaged into another format that you want to hear.
Right.
And so I was taught early on to take the word of God as a whole, is what we have today.
Yep.
And I see I'm on TikTok, you see the attacks on the Bible like that. And
Oh,
so that
it's
was a
unbelievable.
foundational for me to not diminish the word of God.
That's really awesome. We just got done talking about parenting and how important it is to, parenting's marriage and all the things that go along with that.
Yeah.
But this should be a big heads up to the dads out there of just how important it is to instill some of these disciplines into your kids. I didn't have that same experience. And so that's something I had to kind of learn on my own. And
Hmm.
honestly, like truthfully, still learning, still getting better at, still trying to hone in on that a little bit. So for our listeners, I connected so well with you being able to do it the right way. I want to make sure our listeners don't get discouraged in thinking, well, I can't do that.
Yeah.
We have more resources now than we've ever had in order to help you do that. We have every podcast known to man, including this one. We have Bibles on your phone now. We have so many translations. We have so many videos you can watch on YouTube. There's a million ways that you can dig into a discipline. And so if you're like me and you're just like, wow, I wish I had the discipline Tim had at age 13. I wish I had that discipline now. Cool. You can get there. You can
Yeah.
totally do that. And that's what's so great about our faith. That's what's so great about our God, is that we're all in process.
That's right.
We all recognize that we're at different places. We come from different backgrounds. We come from different families. We come from different upbringings. And, we've experienced what we've experienced, but ultimately we're all in process, and that can be celebrated.
Yeah.
And the good news is you have a guy right here in Tim that you can reach out to, you can connect with, and, let him know that you're having a tough time in that area, and he can totally help you and give you some pointers and help guide you through that. So
Yeah.
I really, it's just really profound to hear, the age that you were at and the disciplines you had. Really, really cool. Appreciate you sharing the journey. And as you said, you're still on it. It's still a daily thing. You're still
Yeah.
dying to yourself every day. And, it's great. It's really great.
Yeah. And now, after college, it was one of those things where made some bad decisions in relationships, made some bad decisions because I had stayed at home and commuted for college. And then after college, I
Okay.
was by myself for a couple of years. And those couple of years before I got married were tough because I was really searching for finding my place in this world, finding love in a relationship, and looking in
And what
some wrong
age was this?
places.
So
What's
you
that?
were at 20, you were at like
22,
24,
23,
22.
24. Yeah, those
Okay.
those times. And
Yeah.
looking back, it's funny because I was just like this, I have to get married, I have to get married, I have to get married. It was just like this weird desire where I don't even know where it was from, other than just that I had seen people get married younger than I was. Like my mom got married when
Hmm.
she was 18, my sister got married young. And so there
Yep.
was this innate desire for it. Of course I wanted it, but also this, like, not just enjoying being single in the season God had me. It was this goal where, like, if I can just get married, then, any lustful desires will go away. Anything that, this completionist mentality, like I achieved it type of
You've now
thing.
yeah, I'm right where I need to be now.
Yeah.
I
And I look
finally have
back
what
and
it
I just,
takes.
like,
Right.
if I could have just chilled out a little more, enjoyed my time being single, understand more of who I was in Christ first, right? That's the wisdom I would have told myself back then, is just,
Yeah.
it's okay, man. You're young 20s, early 20s. Like, you
Yeah.
got time, brother. Like, just
Yeah.
be patient a little bit. And God was still faithful to me, even through my crazy decisions, and brought me Jamie, my wife, and we connected when I was 24, got married when I was 25. And so that started us on that journey. And she grew up in the church too. And her dad was a pastor as well. And so we both had that strong background. And what I would encourage people to, as you're struggling or dealing with sin, or not quite where you want to be, is stay faithful to the things that you know you need to do. And for me, that was going to church. Like, I never abandoned going to church, even as I was questioning things, or even as I was in sin. I still went to church, and it sounds like I'm a hypocrite, but I think the other option is I could have just not gone, and I
Right.
could have gone deeper into the sin, or deeper into my own quote path, but I still, like, held on to God as much
It's
as I
great.
could in that moment,
Yeah.
and realizing that I wasn't perfect. I don't recommend, like, oh, do this and struggle with sin and stay in church. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, like, if you find yourself struggling, if you're at a season in life where things are hard and you're not where you thought you'd be 10 years ago, hold on to that
Yeah.
lifeline being God, not just the act of going to church, but don't completely abandon your faith. And there is grace to be had for you as you struggle and as you're dealing with things. God's not going to leave you, but also don't leave him. Don't just say, okay, I'm good, I don't need you, I'm not going to go to church for a couple of years and we'll see how it turns out. That
Right.
has a tendency to turn worse for you as you go down a path that I'm just going
Yeah,
to
then
figure
you're
it out, you know?
siloed, you're out of community, no
Exactly.
one knows what you're going through. I mean, there's a, you know, I've really, I think I've told you, I've really gotten into studying animals and like predators specifically. And the one thing that every predator has in common is they look for the lonely and the weak.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter if it's a polar bear or if it's a coyote, like it's going to look for alone and weak.
That's right.
And the devil's no different, alone and weak, alone and weak. So,
Mm-hmm.
even if you of course don't have it all figured out, none of us do, but even if you're feeling like you're in a tough season, being in community, being around a group of people that understands that has been through what you're going through, or at least can have empathy for you and pray for you and cover you in that kind of protection, like that's such a win. That's such a great thing to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And for a lot of part of my late 20s, 30s was working retail management, which was crazy and stressful times. And, I get when there's a season of life where you're just trying to keep your head above water, just trying to stay afloat, trying to do what's in front of you,
Yep.
providing for my family was always instilled in me as just this thing that I need to do. And so, sacrificing in a job that I necessarily didn't always want to be at, but understanding that, and understanding that God still got me, it
Yeah.
was never a goal where I'm at now. And I've talked about this before in my journey is the goal was never someday I'll be a pastor. Someday I can do full-time ministry. I just
Right.
kept grinding, kept doing what was in front of me. And then until God kind of started to mature me more in the faith, started saying, okay, here's new opportunities for you. Here's a new open door. Do you want to step in it?
Mm-hmm.
And then it was really one open door after another that kind of
Yeah.
led me to where I am today. And that's often how life works. You look back 10 years ago and you're like, oh, wow, I did not see this coming. I did not know I'd be
Right.
here today, but it's
Totally.
through God's faithfulness. And that continues to be a part of your story. And so when I tell my testimony, I love talking about the last 4 or 5 years, especially because that was God's faithfulness to pull me out of a job that was killing me, both spiritually and physically.
Yeah.
And also to be able to put me in a place where I can give back some of the things that God has placed in me to other people by doing things like this podcast with you and
Yeah.
being able to do full-time ministry with that never being the goal. And I think God's so good because he knows your skills and abilities he's given you, and he knows your heart. He knows that he has something better for you if you just trust him.
Yeah.
But sometimes there's that season where you just have to be like, all right, I'm in the thick of it now. I don't know where the next year is going to hold, but I got to stay faithful to
Yeah.
God. So
How long were you in that season of retail where you felt like you were just getting crushed before God brought you out of it to ministry?
oh man, that's a good question. I think 2018, I started having the call for full-time ministry, and I didn't get out until the end of 2020. And so there was probably two,
Yeah. So
3 years
two,
when,
3 years. Wow.
yeah. And before that, there was this, I don't know how to describe it. There was almost this weight over me that I just knew that I couldn't keep this up for another 10 years. And I didn't know that meant
Right.
going to ministry. I thought that meant doing another secular
Right.
job, which it would have been fine for me. There was never like, oh, I have to be in ministry to be complete in life. Like that was never my thought. Uh,
Sure.
and I think what was cool too is towards the end of my stay in retail was God was really teaching me that I can serve him there too and be a light to other people,
Yeah.
where my personality and my work ethic is just nose to the grindstone, get it done, focus
Yeah.
on the blinders, right? And some of my maturity was understanding like there's people here that are hurting. There's people here that I'm in a liberal company and I can't necessarily share my testimony or the gospel to them, but I can ask them questions. I can show love to
Sure.
them. I can just, hey, do you go to church and why not? Like I can still ask those kind of questions. So the last couple of years at the job, I started doing more of that. And I think it was cool. And another thing, like you look back, like, oh, I wish I could have told myself 15 years ago these things, right? We all have those moments. That was one of those things I wish I could have told myself. Like this is a mission field. Like if you're in
Yeah.
a secular company, that is a mission field, right? It doesn't mean
Yeah.
that you're constantly being a missionary and talking about God, but wherever God has you, be a light and do
Totally.
it to the best of your ability.
Yeah. That's profound, thinking through how long you were in that position, and that gap between, I know God's calling me into something, I just don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
and I know he's calling me out of where I am, but I have to stay where I am. I guarantee you someone listening to this podcast is going, I'm right there. I'm in a place where
Yeah.
I know that God's calling me out. I know this isn't the end all be all. I just don't know what the next step is yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that your story is an encouragement, because sometimes it's not a month. Sometimes it's not 3 weeks. Sometimes it's 3 years.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is a long time. Sometimes you do have to be patient. Sometimes you do have to wait. What can you do while you're waiting? Well, you can be
Right.
a light to those around you. What can you do while you're getting just, you know, beat up and exhausted, and you can't take it anymore? What can you do? Well, you can pray, and you can be an example to those around you, knowing that if God's going to pull you out of that, it takes time. That's one of the things I love about the story of Moses, is that, like, Moses comes to free the slaves. How many people do you think wanted to get out of that situation and never heard from God and thought that there was no hope? And the whole time that God's not talking to them, he's talking to Moses.
Mm.
Right. So understand, like, if you're in that season where you need to get out, you're just ready. If you feel like God doesn't have an answer for you yet, or you haven't seen what's next, that doesn't mean he's not talking to somebody else.
Yeah. And Moses was in the wilderness well, not the wilderness, but he was in where'd he go? The other city. He got excommunicated, ran away, right? And
Oh yeah.
he was
Right.
there for
Right.
20 years. I don't know exactly what it was, but
Yeah. Yeah.
and that was like training grounds where God finally was like, okay, you're ready. Whatever anger you lashed
Right.
out to kill the Egyptian, whatever he had to work on through Moses, which we don't hear a lot of that story in the Bible, but
Right.
whatever it was a time away where, again, that's 20 years of people being oppressed, of people in slavery, of people wondering if an answer would ever come.
Right.
And we read past that in the Bible sometimes. We're like, oh yeah, 20 years went by. It's like, well, that's big
It's a
chunk of time.
long time.
Big
Yeah.
chunk of time, but people wondering, are we ever going to get out of this? And
Right.
all during God knew Moses was being, built up, ready to go.
His life is such a 40-year spectrum of preparation. Well, actually, it's more of the preview, right? So the first 40 years, you get the preview of his life, and he gets an idea of what's about to happen.
Yeah.
Then he gets preparation for 40 years, and then the
Mm-hmm.
promise. We
Right.
jump right to the promise.
Yeah.
we jump to the promise, and we're like, God, get me out of this. And it's like that preview, preparation, promise, right? So
Yeah.
that's great, and really, really great of you to share your story. I know, even for me, like, super encouraging. I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are able to identify with some spots of your story, and also learn from others. So I think that's really, really good, man.
Cool. Thank you. Let's hear from you.
So I was different. So what what I think our listeners are going to hear here is now we have kind of the other side of that. Now, I don't have a story that takes you as far as, like, drugs, alcohol, that kind of thing, but it's definitely further down that spectrum. It's fascinating also that we both grew up in similar households, but not with similar habits. And I think that's just a testimony probably to either how we were raised, or also just our personalities in general, which is great. All right. So let's pick up at the great moment of being 8 years old. I'm 8 years old, grew up a pastor's kid, and accepted Christ. Okay. So this is the whole thing where you walk down front, they ask you 3 questions. Do you love Jesus with all your heart? Yes. Do you promise to follow him all the days of your life? Yes. Are you accepting Jesus today? Yes. Like, and if, as long as you say yes, which I already knew, man, I knew the answers to the test here. As long as you answer yes to those questions, you get baptized. And I was 8 years old, and I'll be honest with you, I just knew it was something I was supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the pastor's kid. I've watched everybody else's kid go up front. Like, you just do it. And I do feel like it was authentic. I do feel like to a point, I knew that there was a God, And I knew and had been taught that God loved me and loves me, but no real full understanding of what I was getting myself into, which, you're 8 years old. I think that's kind of how it goes. I do remember when I got baptized by my dad, which was a really cool experience. I was so short that my feet couldn't touch the bottom of the baptismal. And so I got baptized and then swam off. So my dad is going, go and walk in newness of life. I'm like doggy paddling
Yeah.
to the side because I couldn't touch the bottom. So made that decision when I was 8. And I grew up in a house where I really think between my dad and mom, I think they really were banking on the church to kind of raise me.
Mm.
My dad was a pastor. He talked about God. We knew my parents were Christians. There certainly wasn't any kind of debate. My dad was one of the most generous people I've ever met, and I watched him give away money that literally we didn't have because he felt called to. And then my mom, I watched her be the most servant leader I think I've ever seen in my life, and full of grace and full of love. And so we never questioned any of that. But as far as like sitting down as a family, going through scripture, going through the Bible, getting taught one-on-one by our dad, like that didn't happen. That just wasn't him. But he did that at church, right? So it was kind of this like, as long as I can get the church rolling here, like that will be good because you guys will learn it at church. The challenge with that is like my personality is so anti-authority and so anti, as soon as somebody says we have to do something this way, my first question is there a better way? Why do we have to do it that way? What's the why behind that? And then if you can't answer it, then I really don't believe you and I'll just kind of do my own thing. So you can imagine, like, I struggled with student pastors. I struggled with youth pastors. I struggled really believing them because it was always this like guy who was trying to be cool and wearing, plaid shirts and, needing to, really like wow me with, the fact that he could play basketball or that he was a cool guy. It's like, dude, I don't need you to be me. I need you to be you. And so struggled also with authority in school. Like my middle school and high school grades are nothing to write home about. And so in growing up and kind of thinking that way, the other thing that I had kind of tugging at me is I had this musical ability. I was very musical. I could play any instrument you put in front of me, self-taught. I sang. I could write poetry. I could write songs. I was just, I had a lot of musical talent. So I'm looking at worship pastors and I'm looking at like, okay, I have musical talent. What does that look like in the church? I'm like, oh, a guy who leads the choir. I'm all set. I'm all set, man. I don't want to do that. A guy who I branded Sunday sensations that just comes up to the piano once a month and does, sings I Can Only Imagine, and everybody goes, oh, that was so good. Like I just didn't buy any of that. So as soon as I was old enough to leave the church on my own, I did. And it wasn't a I hate God or I hate these people kind of thing. It was just I don't know what value this is really bringing me right now.
Yeah.
And I just felt like everybody was fake. That's one of the other things of growing up in a pastor's home. You have your dad come home from meetings discouraged, upset, weight of the world on his shoulders.
Yeah.
And you hear him tell my mom who it was that said something that was just awful at a meeting. Stands up, speaks out of turn. So, I mean, and I have a list, bro. Like I could name these people still to this day by name that I remember from, 10 years old until now that have just, they don't realize the family they're affecting when they say dumb stuff. And I remember, and then I'd see those people on Sunday and it'd be like, oh, hey, good morning. So good to see you. And I'm just like, dude, like, Like, I hate you right now. Like,
Yeah.
like I'm 16. I got mad hate for you right now.
Mm.
And so, so I didn't really have the spiritual disciplines nor the spiritual knowledge and really understand what I was doing. But in all that, I still knew there was a God. I still knew that I was purposed for something. So, so I decided, like an immature human being would do, I decided that I would just kind of figure it out. So God has a great plan for me. That's what I felt on my life. God has a great plan for me.
Yeah.
Even when I was in middle school, man, like I went to middle school retreats and had people. I had Clayton, Clayton King from what is that, New Spring? He's the pastor at New Spring.
Okay.
So in Anderson, South Carolina. So Clayton King was at a middle school retreat. He prayed over me one time and was like, God has big plans for you. I know he does. You're going to be in ministry. You're going to lead. You're going to lead people through some of the toughest times. You're going to be this unbelievable leader. You're going to do all this stuff. And I'm like in the 7th grade, 8th grade, like, dude.
Did that scare you?
Yeah, I was like, instead of being in a position to receive that, I was just like,
Yeah.
cool, bro. Cool. Thanks for sharing. I don't even know if I like the people that I'm here on this retreat with. And
Let me ask you real quick, as someone you
yeah, do
said that
it.
struggled with authority, and if someone told you
Yeah.
something, you do the opposite, asking for a friend who might have a son similar.
Yeah.
um, what do you think, without having, the maturity of 20, 30 years later, what do you think at that time? What reached you? What did you want to do when someone would tell you? Like, what was it? Was it how they messaged it to you? Was it understanding the whys, like you kind of referred to? Like, how would you reach someone like that to get them to do something that was good for them?
Yeah. Value outside of my actions,
Gotcha.
value outside of my grades. Um, so I had this teacher, Dr. Markoch. Um, he I to this day believe that he's the reason I even like stayed in school.
Mm.
Incredible teacher. He never was concerned about what grade I was making in other classes. He was never concerned about if I was learning the material. He always recognized what I was going through and challenges that I might be experiencing, and always spoke to my potential and always spoke to my gift set. Now,
Mm.
that's not, you can't do that always. I mean, look, at some point you just have to go, I was a really tough kid. And I had a lot of self-esteem issues, and I was short. I didn't do what everybody else did. I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, I didn't go to parties, I went to church. Um, Everything was a little harder for me in sports because of my size. I had to have kind of this, you know, don't mess with me attitude, but then times that I did want to be liked, I didn't really fit in anywhere. I played sports and I was in band. I was the only person in band that played sports and the only person in sports that did band. You know what I mean? Like there's not many people that do both and do it at a high level.
Yeah.
So the thing that stood out to me was when teachers would go, you have to get this question right. When teachers would go, hey, Drew, I had a teacher that called on me one time that I knew the answer. And I'll never forget this. This is when I really started looking back and understanding why I am the way I am and who I was then. I would have a teacher go, Drew, the answer to number 3, what do you have? And I'd look down and I'd go, all right, I have 48 as my answer. And I'm like looking at the problem and I'd be like, oh, I hope this is right. And I'm like in my own mind going, before you say it, just golly, I was right. And then the teacher would do something stupid, in my opinion, and go, come on, we just went over this. And I'd go,
Just shut down.
and I just look at them and they'd go, do you have an answer for number 3? And I'd go, and I just shut down.
Yeah.
So it's the moments where it's like, you should do this. You should know this. You should do that. If somebody in that same situation would be like, come on, I bet whatever you have down is right. Come on, I bet whatever you wrote down is good. Come
Yeah.
on, I know you know how to do this. If you'll tell me what you got, even if you got it wrong, we'll go through it.
Yeah.
Like speaking in an encouraging way. And it was the same way with coaches growing up. Like I'm not the kind of guy that needs, I don't need some dad, some guy who teaches gym and also coaches baseball. I don't need some guy trying to like give me some kind of tough love. You're this, and you got to find a way to fight. Like, dude, I don't need that. I got every piece of motivation in me as this guy who
Yeah.
grew up just kind of like not liking things. So I always would have the best brought out in me by people that encouraged, by people who gave me freedom to try and discover it on my own. Give me a little, like, to this day, man, you want me to be at my best? Like, you can put guardrails around me. Make sure those guardrails are pretty distant though. Like you want to really see me like just shut down and feel like I have no way out and I'm trapped, put me in a box. And if
Gotcha.
you put me in a box, I'm just going to go, all right, this isn't for me. Like I need guardrails, absolutely, but I need people to recognize that sometimes like the road needs to be under construction and new guardrails need to be built. Because that's just how my mind is wired. And you know that. You've been around me long enough. Like I look at something and I'm like, I wonder how we could do it in the most crazy and best way. And it's like, well, that doesn't always mean that it's like the best way.
Yeah.
That doesn't always mean that it's the way to go. So you still need that accountability around you and people around you to check yourself. But those people have to be trusted. And it's hard to trust somebody when all they've done is spoken to who you should be or how you're coming up short.
I've heard that described for God's, perfect and permissive will, describing that. I heard it described well. Someone described it almost like a parking lot where God gives you the parking lot, but then all the different parking spots, it's up to you where you want to park, where, there's parameters around the lot. God won't let you go outside of that, but then within the free will, like he allows you to make decisions based on your free will and based on the parameters he set. I think that's a good picture. It's not perfect by any means, but
no, I think it's a great picture.
Allows us to understand that God's still sovereign, but he allows us the free will, and the mix between the two is so hard for our minds to comprehend, but it
depending on the season you're in, depending on the season you're in and the car you're driving, you might want to park close to where you're getting out, or you might want to park farther away from everybody so your car doesn't get dinged, like that. I love that analogy with the parking lot. That's great.
With understanding, that when you start saying God wills me to sin, once you start putting that upon God's sovereignty, then you lose me, because that's not God's heart, and totally. Sin is abhorrent to God. And so there's that balance between, God allows it because he also desires us to love him fully, right, with the free will. So anyway, I won't get off on that topic. So you left.
No,
you
it's really
church.
Good. Yeah, no, it's fantastic. So I leave church. I don't feel like I leave God, but at the same time, my prayers are very transactional. So I kind of do everything that I can do. And then I'm like, God, will you help me? So, I'll fast forward a little bit. Let's get to early 20s, which is kind of where you recognized, hey, I'm single and I got some things going on in my life. I want to achieve some things, and you wish you could go back and tell yourself something. Well, that same age for me. Like if I could go back and tell my early 20s something, I would, that would be the age.
Yeah.
I'm living with a girl that I'm dating. Okay, you can put 2 and 2 together with that. All right. Living with a girl that I'm dating. At the same time, I'm like talking to other girls. So I'm not even like faithful necessarily, nor was she. We were just terrible people. And then I'm chasing this like music dream. So I'm in Nashville. I'm writing. I did get to write some pretty cool songs, and that ended up on albums and things like that. So that was pretty cool. But all in all, like I'm not even really making ends meet. Like I'm gonna get evicted, and did end up at one point getting evicted from a apartment. And I went through this period where I was like getting tugged at from my parents and from God that like you need to go back home. You need to kind of re-gospel yourself here. You need to really like find this Drew that you had previews of in your middle school and high school days where you really felt the closeness of God, like find that Drew,
Yeah.
re-gospel yourself, do what it takes, submit to your parents, submit to, kind of giving up on your dream to be, this, next big thing in country music, and then see what I have for you. And I'd love to be like, oh, okay. Like I wish the story was, oh, and then when God told me that, I packed up the car and immediately left. I took more of the Jonah approach. And I was like, well, God, if you're gonna if you're gonna want me to go to North Carolina from Nashville, then you gotta make me. It was kind of like that.
Yeah.
And he didn't send a whale, but it was kind of like that. I over the course of the next 6 months after I really felt like I needed to go home, these were things that happened in my life. Walked in on girlfriend cheating on me. That was a highlight of my life for sure. So walked in on girlfriend cheating on me. Got robbed at gunpoint.
Wow.
That was really cool. Had another situation where a gun was pulled out at a party where coke was being done. Again, I didn't really drink, I didn't really do coke, but everyone I hung out with did.
Gotcha.
So guy holding a pistol and running around naked and coked out of his mind.
Wow.
That was exciting. And I didn't leave the party. I was just like, oh, Nashville. And so, like, to this day, you go to Nashville, someone naked with a gun's probably walking around. And then I went to a gig, and on the way to the gig got pulled over by an officer. The guy that I was with going to the gig was like, can't let him check the car, can't let him check my guitar case, out of like on God, can't let him do that. I'm like, why? It's like, I got a lot of drugs in my guitar case. I'm like, oh my gosh. So had that happen. Then one time I went to what was at the time called a pill party, where you walk in and there's just a big thing of pills and people are grabbing handfuls and taking them and mixing them with alcohol. And bro, yeah, it was ridiculous. Had a friend of mine overdose in a parking garage. Had another friend of mine get in a drunk driving accident and die. All of this happened in like less than 6 months.
Yeah.
It felt like every 3 days my phone rang with bad news. And it wasn't just bad news, it was like the worst news,
Yeah.
for a guy my age. And so I was like, all right, let me look at my finances. Well, my bank account's depleted. My girlfriend cheated on me, so I don't guess we could live together anymore. I think I'm done with music because my friend just OD'd, and my other friend that I love doing music with just got in a drunk driving accident. All of the doors that were opening for writing and things like that are starting to not necessarily close. They're just not opening at a rapid enough level. And I kind of give up. I felt kind of where you felt in retail. I felt exhausted. I felt depleted. I felt like there had to be something else, but I didn't really know what anything else was. And so even though I couldn't see the end goal, I could see the next step. And God was like, the next step is you just got to get out of this environment. So I left, moved back in with my parents. My dad and me at that point had a relationship that was really bad because he had been telling me, you got to come home. You got to get out of there. You got to, he saw it.
Yeah.
And his approach was not potential and encouragement. His approach was, you've got to do this. And with my personality, I was like, I'll outlast anybody. My mom loves to tell this story of when I was 9. We were sitting at the dinner table, and my mom said, you haven't eaten your dinner. And I said, I'm done. And she said, well, you're not getting up from the table until you eat your dinner. And she said, I sat at the table and didn't touch my food for like 6.5 hours. And so eventually she was just like, time for bed. I was like, okay. And I went to bed. That was me, man. Like, so when my dad is like, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this, I was like, watch me not do that. and I'll be
Right.
fine, you know?
Right.
So then I'm coming back home. My mom, of course, is just the picture of the dad and the prodigal son, just nothing but love, nothing but glad you're home, nothing but, you know, you're here now, you're safe now. I'm in this with you, that kind of stuff. Dad and me had tension big time because it was, you know, he's still pastor at a church. This is a reflection on him. I get it now.
Right.
As a dad, I kind of get it. And then I needed to make money, so I started selling cars because I do talk, as you can tell, and I do have I do have a passion for cars. I love vehicles and love technology like that. So started selling cars, really good at it. Started off as just a salesman, ended up being like the number one accessory sales manager at Hendrick Auto, and ended up being a used car sales manager, and started making like good money, but it didn't really matter because I was blowing it on stupid stuff. Like I'd buy stupid toys and things like that. So finally, one day after my parents had been asking me to go to church for a really long time, I was like, okay, I'll go to church. And I went, and I had this thought that I would wear a ball hat. Okay. Now that's really significant in my life. Have I told you this story before?
No.
Okay. I think this is an important story, and I think people that are listening, I think this would, if you've kind of written me off at this point and stopped listening, this would be the point to jump back in. When I was 16 years old, I invited a buddy of mine to church. His name was Anthony, and Anthony's parents had just gone through a divorce, and I didn't really know how to, how to talk to him about that. So I just invited him to church because I figured that would be a good idea. The cool thing about Anthony, though, is he was able to wear a hat at school. So Anthony was the only kid in school that got to wear a hat. And one day I asked him, like, how do you get to wear a hat? Because nobody else can. And he said, well, when I was a kid, I had brain surgery. I had a lot of different brain surgeries. I've got scarring. I can't grow hair in some places. I'm really, self-conscious about it. My mom wrote the principal, and the principal gave me special permission to wear a hat. Only kid in school to wear hats. Coolest thing in the world. Like, it instantly made him cool.
Yeah.
Instantly. Right. So I'm expecting him to come to church. He shows up. His mom drops him off in one of these like Lincoln Continental looking cars. He gets out. He's, of course, wearing a hat, and he's wearing one of these puffy like starter jackets. You remember those?
Yeah.
Big starter. So he's wearing a starter jacket. And I dab him up and all this. I'm like, what's up? We start walking in. And as we're walking in, picture this. I'm walking in with a 16-year-old kid who's black. So I have a 16-year-old black kid walking into an all-white church. I have a 16-year-old black kid whose parents are going through divorce, who doesn't know Jesus, walking into a church full of Christians. Okay. So this is the picture.
Yeah.
And as we walk in, a deacon who's out front is handing out bulletins. He looks right at me and he goes, "Hey, good morning," hands me a bulletin. Looks at Anthony, says, "Good morning," hands him a bulletin, and says, "Have some respect, son, and take off your hat." It's like the worst feeling in the world.
Yeah.
It's like the worst. But what do you say? Obviously, I'm sorry, but like, what do you say?
Yeah.
So this kid walks into a church with his hat off. The only thing giving him confidence. Sat next to me the whole church service. Sang a bunch of songs he didn't know. Talked about a God he doesn't know. Left. And you can probably imagine how our relationship ended. He didn't want to talk about it. I didn't know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
So we just stopped being friends.
That's tough.
It's terrible. It's terrible. And I still know the guy who did it. I've never even told him this story, but I still know the guy who did it. And he still goes to a church. And I still like, I could call him. Like, it's unbelievable. And that's why, like, to this day, I am so big on the guest experience. I'm so big on come as you are. I'm so big on whatever walk you've been through, whatever you've experienced in life, just get in the door. And to this day, anytime I see somebody in the parking lot with a hat on, I do a double take, just hoping it's Anthony. He is He is who I serve through. He is my one day. He is my
Yeah.
person that I think about when ministry's tough. And I'm like, what would Anthony need to hear? So that happened at 16. Now I'm walking into church with my parents. So I'm like, guess what? I'm going to wear a hat. I showed up in a West Virginia ball cap, and I got out of the car after I got parked. And this guy said, "Good morning. So glad you're here. Welcome." I'm like, all right, well, I'm outside. Maybe he doesn't need me to take my hat off. Started approaching the building. As I'm approaching the building, all these people, "Hi, good morning. Good to see you." I'm like, dude, y'all are way too happy. And then I got to the door, and this lady opens the door for me, and she's like, "So glad you're here. Come on in." And then I got in and I looked around. I was like, dang, I was like, this church is huge. And this lady comes up to me and says, "Is this your first time here?" I was like, "Is it that obvious?" She said, "Let me show you around." She shows me around. She says, "Well, in a few moments, here are the bathrooms, here's the coffee shop. You've been to a new age church, right? This is what they do." And then takes me to the worship center doors and says, "In a moment, the worship center doors are going to open. Somebody will show you to your seat." And I was like, perfect. That's when somebody will tell me to take my hat off and I can leave. And I can just be like, church is the same. I got escorted in, directed to a seat. Not one person told me to take my hat off.
Mm.
And I can't tell you to this day, I can't tell you what the pastor talked about. I can't tell you one song we sang, but I know every single volunteer by name. The guy who parked my car, Wes, the people who said good morning on my way in, Janelle, the person who gave me the tour, Marianne, the guy who said hello at the meet and greet, Bob. I can tell you them by name because that's the reason. That's the moment. I didn't know it, but that's the moment that the trajectory of my life changed.
Mm.
And a couple weeks later, I got an email from the guy who's the worship director there. His name's Carl. He said, "Hey, I met your mom. Your mom says that you're good at music and that you like music. I wanted to know if me and you could chat sometime, maybe hang out sometime." I was like, cool. He took me to lunch. He brought me back to the church. He put me behind a keyboard. He said, "Show me what you got." He let me start serving. He mentored me. He led me through kind of rededicating my life. This was so cool. There was this moment I walked into his office and I said, "I feel like I need to rededicate my life. Maybe I need to get baptized again." He said, "You need to get baptized again?" I was like, "Well, I got baptized when I was 8. I don't know that it meant anything." He said, "This is what's so great about being in a relationship with Jesus. You don't have to have some big come to faith moment. You don't have to have some big baptism moment. Like if you've already had that, you don't have to do all this again." He said, "You just have to walk out of my office and say, 'Jesus, I'm back. I'm with you. Forgive me.
Mm.
Let's move forward. I love you.'" And I left his office. And by the time I got back to my desk, I had rededicated my life. He let
Wow.
me see the simplicity
Yeah,
and how lovely that kind of relationship is.
that's good.
And so that man is, Carl, greatly responsible for me finding my wife, finding my purpose, and then I started serving in ministry. Then I started working in ministry, and then I started doing that at different churches in different facets, and that's grown from just being a worship leader to now a lead pastor. And here's what's cool. Here's the full circle moment. So that same guy, Carl, who helped me in all that, he was the music director at the church I was at the time. He's now the music director at my church.
Wow, that's awesome.
And so he's greatly responsible for me being where I am. And now I get to do ministry with him again, about 15 years of a gap in between the two things. So, for me, I think a lot of people walk away from the church. I think a lot of people walk away from God. I think a lot of people feel like maybe they've done too much. They're too far gone. God would never accept them. God would never bring them back into relationship or anything like that. Like we have to understand, listeners, we have to understand that since the beginning of time, God has been pursuing us.
Right.
And so he's not going to give up now. And so even if we feel too far gone, even if we feel like we are not where we want to be. Well then let's put some effort into it. Let's work at it. And it's really as simple as just saying, God, would you forgive me for how I've just kind of gone off the path here? Would you just kind of reignite my spirit here
Yeah.
and allow me to connect with you in a better and more deep way? And that's that's my testimony that I'm still living out. And it's an incredible journey, but I'll tell you, it took God putting me in a really difficult spot. He putting a lot of guardrails around me to where, and thank God, because he really was like, I'm going to make this to where you only have one way out.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's to either be so detrimental to you and the people around you, or to get back to me.
Yeah.
And then I had just some great people, some great men in my life, great parents, that set a great foundation, that even when I was, away, I still knew what I had been taught. I still knew truth.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it really does take a village. and and for me, I'm a perfect example of that. I think it took every single person in my life, and some of those things that I experienced that were negative in church now are motivation for me to do it
Mm.
right and reach
That's
people
yeah.
like me.
That's the difference, taking the pain and using it for purpose. I think
Yeah.
with when we look back and thank you for sharing, because it shows God's faithfulness, but also your responsibility, and how he can point you in the right direction, but ultimately obedience is one step at a time. And so when you had to get out
Yep.
of Nashville, that was the
Yeah.
first step. That was a big step. And it didn't mean that you knew the next 20 steps. It means that you had to do
No.
the first one in order for the other ones to be visible. And
Yeah.
too often in our life, we're like, oh, I won't move until I see the next 10 years. It's like, well, you better thank God he doesn't show you more than you can handle, which is what's right
Right.
in front of you, because we could
Right.
not comprehend if I knew the next, the future pain, the future joys, the future stuff,
Right.
until you're ready for that moment. And I think the other part
Right.
of your story too that stuck out with the hat incident was the fact that rules without relationships will burn people. If you
Love
just
it.
see rules,
Yep.
if that greeter knew Anthony's story and had that relationship, he would have never asked the question. But because there was some you don't find that in the Bible, to not wear a hat into church, but at the same time, it became a rule that was
Oh,
something that, oh, to be a good Christian, you got to follow this rule, without ever explaining, even if there was a good reason for it. He
yeah,
didn't
it's
take the time
terrible.
to explain the
Yeah.
reason, and he also didn't have a
Yeah.
relationship with them to be able to demonstrate that properly. And so I think as a ministry leader myself, like, there's a lot of Christian rules that we put onto people that may or may not be biblical. And even if they are biblical, to be able to explain them in a way that shows love and grace, and
Oh yeah.
I will help you through this process. I will hold your hand. And you had someone to hold your hand. And that
Yep.
goes so far for mentorship and community, and not just getting people in the doors and then forgetting about them, but also going through life with them. And if
Right.
someone's listening, you don't have a mentor, or if you can be a mentor, either one of those two things, you have to do one or the other. You
Yep.
have to
Yep.
either be mentored or you have to be a mentor. And being a mentor doesn't mean you have to have a certificate saying you're a mentor. It means that if you can share a testimony like we did today, that means you can help somebody. If you can
Yeah.
just explain the basics about the Bible, or just read the Bible with somebody,
Right.
it's not this grandiose thing. It's just saying that I want to help you through life. I want to walk alongside with you. I want to be a voice that you can talk to. I'm here for you. That's all a
Yeah.
mentor is, right?
Yeah.
We often hear the word mentor and we're just like, oh, I'm not qualified. I was, well, join the club,
Like, just
right? Like,
invest, man. Invest in people.
yeah.
Invest time, invest relationship, invest your mind and your heart. And
I
it
lo-
goes a long way.
Speaking of obedience, I wrote this quote. I read My Utmost for His Highest from Oswald Chambers recently, and I grew up
Okay.
reading that. My mom would read it, and so I found the book at church, and I was like, "Oh, this is going on my desk. I'm going to read this." So yesterday, it was talking about obedience. It says the counterfeit of obedience is a state of mind in which you create your own opportunities to sacrifice yourself,
Hmm.
and your zeal and enthusiasm are mistaken for discernment. It's easier to sacrifice yourself than to fulfill your spiritual destiny. And I think
Wow.
oftentimes we say like, oh, I'm just serving the Lord. I'm just living life. I'm just doing all these things. And those might be your own plans. Those might be the
Yep.
things that you've put yourself into to create yourself as a spiritual martyr for God when he never asked
Mm,
you to do it. It's a lot
boom.
harder to actually do what God asks you to do and be obedient to the things that may not seem glamorous, that may not seem like you're going to get this huge platform, but still are obedient to God. That's where we have to inject ourselves and not
Yeah.
coming up with these, huge plans on our own and forgetting to include God in them.
That's really great. Yeah, you're exactly right. Exactly right. Love the quote. So then here comes the next question, right? And this has obedience all over it. So now our listeners, they might be in different phases. You might have somebody that's like, I share my testimony all the time. I doubt there's a lot of people that are in that category,
Right.
but you might have somebody doing that. Then you might have somebody that's like, I mean, I know my testimony and I share it when I have an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have probably this third group that's like, I don't even, yeah, I don't share my testimony. That's not what I do.
Yeah.
How can we across the board, all three, how can we have them step into a level of obedience today?
I would say if you're listening and you know Jesus, you have a testimony. It's not a question of whether you have it or not. So let's get that out of the way. The second part is, you know, it's going to be one of those things. You don't have to share it because we say to, because then you might just not do it because you got Drew's personality, right? We could be that on that level. But
There you go.
if
That
God
could.
is touching your heart, listening to us, I would encourage you to share it. And what you can do is simply, when you see this graphic on social media, go to the Eyes on Jesus Facebook community. You'll see this graphic when it comes out. Share that on your Facebook page with a small snapshot of your testimony.
Love it. Yep.
And that's a simple way saying, hey, I loved hearing this episode. Here's my testimony. And not only are you sharing your testimony, but all of your Facebook friends that may not know,
Yep.
based on your profile, how where you're at with God, they'll see that. And that's how we can use social media for good. You might do an audio clip of this, or there's a lot of ways to do it. I'll let you figure that out. But the important part is to take some action on this, and share your testimony with somebody. Even if you share it with
Yeah.
one friend saying, hey, I listened to this episode. Why don't you listen to it and then get back with me and we can talk. And I'll share my
Yeah.
testimony with you after you listen to this episode.
Yeah.
You could use it for
And I'll
that.
give you a couple layers too. So listeners, do it for you, because as you share your testimony, you'll recognize the grace, the love, and the
That's right.
pursuit
And you'll get comfortable with
of
it.
God. Secondly, if you can't get to that level, if you're like, yeah, I hear you, Drew, but like, I already know all that stuff. I don't even want to share it. Okay, then share it for me. Share it for a guy who just told you a story about Anthony. And now I have no idea what happened to Anthony. I don't know what he's into. I don't know what's going on in his life. What if Anthony were to see your post and somehow reconnect with me? Like if you can't share your testimony for you, and you can't figure out a way to share your testimony for the friends that are on your Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, whatever, like then I'll give you a third option. Share it for me.
Yeah.
Share it for a guy who's just giving you hours of his time in hopes that you get to keep your eyes on Jesus a little more during the week. Do it for me. Do me a solid, do me a favor, and I'll really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. It's encouraging to us when we see your comments, when we hear from you guys. And so, yeah, do it for us.
Love
We
it.
love you guys. Thanks for joining us today. Hopefully this blessed you in some way. Always, until next time, go with God, grow in discernment, keep your eyes on Jesus.